The next speaker, and then for the next segment of the agenda, I'm going to rely on my colleagues from the CCIUCN board, Don Carr and Don Minton, to do some introductions. So, but first, I'd like to introduce Stephen Nitah, who is an Indigenous Circle of Experts member and negotiator for the Lutzelk'dene First Nation, to speak to us about another example.
My relations, it's good to be here. It's good to be here on Algonquin territory. I'm happy to be here to share the Nitah story with you. But before I start the presentation, I'd like just to make some acknowledgements. When you're working on a project of this nature, there's lots of organizations and individuals that play a role, and too often we don't acknowledge our partners. Partners like CPAWS Canada and CPAWS Northwest Territories, Ducks Unlimited, TNC Canada, Pew Charitable Trusts, and obviously in any negotiations, there's two parties that have to be willing to move forward to make successful agreements. So in that spirit, I'd like to acknowledge Parks Canada and their negotiating team, the Government of Northwest Territories and their negotiating team. I also would like to acknowledge my colleagues from the ICE Committee. We've grown quite a bit together over the last, since pretty much beginning of the fiscal year. I remember we were having a beer after the National Parks Conference in Banff, and we were talking about how we could move things forward. And I think we've done quite a bit since that conference. So, but I also want to acknowledge the work of Nadine, Scott, the Secretary to Pathways. One of the promises I made was to try to keep Margot Bishop from getting gray hairs, and that was on April 1st. It wasn't an April Fool's joke. And today, her last day at being 29. Her birthday is tomorrow. Happy birthday, Margot. Thank you for everything. And she just told me she doesn't have gray hair yet, so I've kept my promise. As you heard today, we talked pretty much, I think we're focusing on, we're starting broad, international level, national level, and the regional level. Now we're going to talk about one specific area, Nitah, land of our ancestors. Obviously, this presentation I put together was for my own people in a workshop we had a year ago, and it's for the Quechua people in the Quechua territory. Okay, how do you move this thing forward or backwards? For this photograph was taken in the 80s right at the end of the Great Slave Lake at the mouth of the Lockard River. We talk about relationships, and a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about protected areas in this country, we're talking about relationships. We're talking about relationships between people, and we're talking about relationships between people and land and the environment. This is a great example of a relationship people have with their environment. It's a photo. It was the last day of our gathering. We have an annual gathering at the end of the Great Slave Lake every summer in my community. It's to make a pilgrimage to the Lady in the Falls. The story goes back hundreds of years to a time when there were giant beavers, and it was during this time when Cho was the chief at the time, or leader of their people, was leading the people chasing two giant beavers from what we know as Artillery Lake today. It's also called Dachokwe in our language, going towards the Great Slave Lake. But halfway down along the Lockard River, or Dachokwe Deze, Dacho killed one of the beavers. And there was real hard times at that time. It was a time of famine. There was an elderly lady that wanted beaver blood, and there wasn't enough to go around, so she was refused beaver blood. The next day, the people continued chasing the second large beaver towards the Great Slave Lake. When they got to the Great Slave Lake, or the mouth of the Lockwood River, or we call it just Nitah in our language, they realized that that old lady wasn't with them anymore. So Dacho sent a couple of young runners back to find her. And this is a good hard 12-hour run. That's how far they went in that one day. By the time they got to her, she was sitting in the river, and she had indicated that through her despair, she really prayed hard to the Creator. This is before Catholicism and all that introduction, so she really prayed hard to the Creator. And the Creator came to her and asked her to sit right there. And she's instructed to sit there until the end of time. For anybody that needs her help, or the Creator's help through her, in spiritual, physical, mental. And if you believe in her, you could always go to her and ask for those help. And we've had thousands of visitors from all over North America going to that place. We had people that there with terminal cancer that left and are still alive today. People left crutches in that site. It's all about belief system and how that the belief system invokes the natural medicines that's within our bodies. But it's also about relationship with the land and the spirit and the Creator. So it's all connected. So my people go to that site as a pilgrimage every summer. And hopefully in July of 2019, we're going to invite many of you people in this room to celebrate the Nitah creation. There's a long history of protected areas and the relationship with the Crown governments. Not all good. It's getting better. Am I controlling the... no? Next slide, please. In the 1920s, the Ceylon Game Sanctuary was created. My people weren't consulted or accommodated. It still exists. A lot of my people were go ahead, next slide. And here's the Ceylon Game Sanctuary in relation to where my community is in the territory. Go ahead. Further up. As Eli indicated, the history of Canada can be reflected in the protected areas as a microcosm. This is right across the board, not just in the protected areas. And that history exists, and within that backdrop we are working today. Go ahead. 1969, when Trudeau Sr. was the Prime Minister and Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs, they wanted to create a national park in our territory. Go ahead. And they withdrew an area of interest and created protected it through a land withdrawal, and that still exists today. So here is a tool that can be used today: is land withdrawals, whether by federal or provincial or territorial governments. Go ahead. Chief Lockhart in the 1980s told the Parks Canada people to take your maps and get the hell out of town. Your proposal and our way of life don't jive. Go ahead. 1990s, the largest staking rush in the history of mankind happened in the Northwest Territories when diamonds were discovered. We're talking about miners throwing stakes into people's yards to claim land so they could explore. Go ahead. With the fact that the Constitution Act of 1982 recognized Aboriginal treaty rights, and by 1990, by 2000, that empty box that it was created when Section 35 was starting to fill up with definition of what those rights really mean, there was a comfort by my community and my elders to explore the possibility of a protected area. Go ahead. So in 2000, Chief Felix Lockhart of that day sent a letter to Parks Canada to see if Canada was still interested. They expressed interest. Go ahead. So in 2005, led by the elders, the community named the area of interest, Nitah. It was pretty much done through a vote, a contest actually. And this is a presentation gives you a good idea what an Indigenous community and government will go through in creating a protected area. Maybe not as sophisticated as this, but the North is a big territory, and you've seen we're doing our part in creating protected areas. And you have to think big when you're living in that type of a territory, and that's what we were doing. We were thinking big. Here's the area of interest the elders drew the map for us. This is what they wanted to protect, this area. Obviously, they wanted to connect it to the Thelon Game Sanctuary to create one continuous corridor. Go ahead. In 2006, Chief Adi Jonathan signed an MOU with then Minister of Environment, Rona Ambrose, to investigate the feasibility. So in 2006 to 2010, my community did a lot of research, not only in Canada, but internationally on best practices of how to create protected areas and manage it. 2007, Canada sent the map back and says, okay, this is an area of interest that we want to explore our relationship in. We didn't push back. We accepted that 33,000 square kilometers, and that area is under land withdrawal today, the entire area. Government Northwest Territories does that now, but again, it's a tool that's used, and there's no third-party interest can be created within that area of interest because of that land withdrawal. Go ahead. Any major protected area, especially under the National Parks Act, requires a mineral and energy assessment to be concluded. This is a map of that assessment. All the hot spots you see are high potential for mineral development, mineral potential. And along the Lockard River is one of the finest rivers for renewable energy, for hydro dams. In fact, my community had to push back against several attempts to dam that river. And the last big push was not only done by Crown governments and industry, but with our partners, our treaty partners within the Acacia process, who wanted to make money from that. And it's one of the reasons why CCIUCN today insists that Thaidjan and Nitah is their process. They're the ones that are going to run with it, because others are not pure in their relationship with that land, especially if they want to develop it for economic purposes. Go ahead. In 2010, as we started, just before we started the formal negotiations with Parks Canada, the community created a vision for itself to guide not only the negotiating team, but the community and the membership and future chief and councils. With this vision, what the members asked the chief of that day and future chiefs is that we're going to follow this vision. We're going to go through the whole process, start to finish, and at the end of the day, the members will vote on Thaidjan and Nitah, whether they accept the relationship or establishment agreements to create the national park and the territorial park in partnership with the government of Northwest Territories. No chief and council, because of their political ideology or position, can change that process. So that process is locked in, and they locked in future chiefs and councils to that process. So for those NGOs that are working with Indigenous governments, a good example to follow. Next. In 2010, as chief of the day, I signed the framework agreement that guides the negotiations, that launch and guides the negotiations with then Minister and late Jim Prentice, good guy. Next. Between 2010 and 2013, we gave ourselves 2 years in 2010 to finalize or come to an agreement in principle. Right in the heart of the negotiations, Parks Canada decided to do a restructuring exercise, so we had to stop the negotiations. But we reached agreement in principle in 2013, in the fall of 2013 with Parks Canada. The only thing that we had to resolve after that were the boundaries and the financial relationship. Next. In 2014, the government of Northwest Territories negotiated and finalized and signed the devolution agreement. by which they've assumed administrative control over all Crown lands in the Northwest Territories. So now we have to get the government of the Northwest Territories to agree to a boundary. And they came to the table in 2015. We had to stop negotiations for a year, almost 2 years, I guess, from 2013 to 2015. They came to the table with a mandate to protect 6,000 square kilometers, the original proposal. Through hard discussions and negotiations between the three parties, LKDFN, Parks Canada, and the government of the Northwest Territories, we convinced the government of Northwest Territories that getting into the protected area business is a good business to get into, especially for the government of Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories is a huge territory. It's large landmass. It's very, very expensive to do business up there. So renewable resource, the only renewable resources that has lasted for the longest time is the trapping industry. Other than that, the government has to depend on non-renewable resources for its income, especially now that they signed the devolution agreement and agreed to pay for all the programs and services. With a population of 40,000 people, with about 19,000 of them are taxpayers, there's not a tax base to support all the programs and service delivery. So they really didn't want to protect lands. They want to keep everything open for development because they're going to make money from the corporate income tax. Next. So in 2016, we've reached agreement with Canada, well, with Northwest Territories in Canada, and we convinced GWT to reduce the Nitah proposed area by 7,000 instead of down to 6,000. And they decided to get into the parks business. So we did a good job in negotiating with them and convincing them that they should look at the protected area business and protected area economies, conservation economies. So in this area, you'll see the map. The dark green is the proposed Nitah National Park Reserve. The light green is the proposed Nitah Territorial Park. And the one on top there is a very interesting one. That area is 2,000 square kilometers, and it's protected under the NWT Wildlife Act. And it's a caribou protected area. And the language we have with the GWT is very interesting. Caribou is the boss in that area. Because it's under a Wildlife Act, it's not a park. If caribou can continue to use that area or able to use that area, it'll stay protected under the Wildlife Act. So caribou is the boss. Caribou tell the parties if they're still using or still can use that area. And it's not just one party. It's not just the government of Northwest Territories that's going to make the decision. It's going to be CCIUCN and government of Northwest Territories together that will make the decision if that will still continue to be protected under the Wildlife Act. So that's 26,000 square kilometers in that area. The governance for Nitah is consensus-based, where the parties will appoint equal members to a governance body to make decisions, that the parties to the agreement will take those decisions and be responsible for implementing. Nitah and the relationship with Canada and the government of Northwest Territories is very unique in the sense that it's more of a joint venture than where traditionally it's Canada or the provinces creating a protected area, creating an advisory body that advises the minister of how the minister manages and operates that protected area. In this case, it's the parties together creating the protected area and managing and governing, managing and operating that together, using their own staff, their own governance system. So when we'll get there. Next. So type of governance. It's a contractual legal agreement. From CCIUCN perspective, we made the treaty with the Crown in 1900. No, most of you could know it as Treaty 8. We don't call it Treaty 8. We call it Treaty of 1900. We don't call it an adhesion to Treaty 8. We call it Treaty of 1900, where we agreed to share the lands and resources, the responsibility, and to manage it together and to benefit together. Last 150 years in Canadian history did not prove that to be very successful. That's where reconciliation, the need for reconciliation, is here today. And that reconciliation can only happen when there's relationship between individuals, because you're all treaty people. It's just not Indigenous people that are treaty. Treaties are made between peoples. Canada, your government, sure, it has administrative control over the treaty relationship, but the direction of what type of relationship has to come from the people, telling their elected representatives in a true democracy of what that relationship should be. So I continue and urge you guys to understand where you are, wherever you are in the country. You're in a relationship, a treaty relationship or other constructive agreements. And what is your role and responsibility in that? I encourage you to all find what that is. Whether you move from one side of the country to another, there's a relationship there. There was a question asked earlier about privately owned lands and how could that be protected. Every square inch of this country is traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. Every square inch. A fee simple land ownership is the highest ownership, legal ownership in this country, but government of Canada doesn't have fee simple ownership. That's the same for Indigenous peoples. So the fee simple is above or below the jurisdiction that is owned by Canada and the Indigenous nations. That was created through that treaty I was mentioning. So from Tlusagaya perspective, in entering in relationship with both federal and territorial crowns, it was based on that understanding and that position where we agreed to share the lands and the responsibilities and the benefits were. So through that, we've created legal contractual agreements. Obviously, all relationships are going to go through disputes. There's going to be misunderstandings and so on. We'll go through a very robust dispute resolution process to resolve those disputes. Like the Guayhanes, Thaiten, and Nitah, the first 3 paragraphs in the agreement is the first paragraph. The Tlusagaya owns and has jurisdiction in this land. Canada says they own and has jurisdiction in this land. The 3rd paragraph is the most important. We agreed to disagree on the first 2, but we agreed to move forward in creating a protected area and managing it together because we feel for this territory. So that's a very important point. So the title to land is not answered. Who owns the title? And if we're going to meet the 17% and go beyond, I think that's the attitude we're going to have to achieve that. So it's a shared jurisdictional model. Trust is an issue. It's still an issue big time in this country. The elder says, sure, we could have the best agreement in the world. We thought we had the best agreement in the world when we made treaty. We still got screwed over. As long as one party has all the financial control, they will ultimately end up with all the control. The governance side, the programs and services side. So what we decided to do was to try something different. We went knocking on doors and we raised $15 million. And we went to Canada and says, match our $15 million, we'll create a Thaiten and Nitah trust fund that will be that will be owned and managed by the First Nations. Through a legal instrument, the first expenditures of the revenues from that trust, whether investment revenues or interest, will be spent by the First Nations in their responsibilities in operation and management of Thaiten and Nitah. Based on the numbers we crunched, we figured it's going to cost between $1 and $2 million a year for the First Nations to fulfill its end of the responsibility. So we come up with a number. That's how we come up with $30 million. With a conservative 3% return on investment, we're looking at about $1 million a year. The principal will never be touched. We'll always be using the revenues from the trust. In that way, CCIUCN has financial control as well, and the taxpayers of the country are not on the hook in perpetuity to support LKDFN participation in the management and operations of Thaidjan and Nitah. It's a unique model. I think that speaks to collaboration, partnership, and a vision. And we know within the philanthropic community there's interest, and there's always been a relationship there anyway. So we've put one aspect of it in the ball for everybody to study. Right? So these are the joint objectives of the parties between Canada and CCIUCN. I don't have much regarding the government of Northwest Territories. Outside of the financial relationship, we've married the agreement as much as possible, because CCIUCN has got to work with both parties, both crowns, in the management operations of Thaidjan and Nitah. We don't distinguish between federal and territorial partners when it comes to Thaidjan and Nitah in the areas of land management. So even though we don't see GWT and LKDF in relationship, just take the PCA's relationship as GWT in this presentation. Go ahead. You guys are all able to read. I won't read this for you. But this is demonstrating the governance and the equality in that relationship, where we both acknowledge each other, we both bring resources to the table. Scientific traditional knowledge will be used to create the programs and services and management plans that will be used in operations and management of Thaidjan and Nitah. Go ahead. So a dispute could be anything. It could be the interpretation of the agreement or a refusal to follow through with a decision of the management board. Either party has the ability to say no to the recommendation or decisions of the management body. But if you have to say no, you have to have a damn good reason. You can't just say no for frivolous or other reasons, because you're going to go through a very robust dispute resolution process. And throughout that process, if that issue is not resolved, it's between the chief and the minister responsible sitting face to face that has to resolve that issue. In that way, it's a government-to-government relationship. So we have to go through the dispute resolution chapter to reach government-to-government relations. So it gives you an idea of the kind of imaginative ways of building relationships. We are hoping to conclude our establishment agreements with the government of Northwest Territories by the end of this fiscal year. We're pretty much done our negotiations with Parks Canada. The government of Northwest Territories right now is just in the process of creating legislation that they will be able to use, the law to be able to use to create protected areas. And even in that process, you have to give kudos to the government of Northwest Territories. They have, all the Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories appoint people to a technical working group that are drafting the proposal for them. They'll receive the proposal by March, or early next month, I hear, and they're hoping they could create a law by October of this year. Even though we're big footprint, small population gives us the ability to make gains and headroads in that type of relationship that I think the rest of the Canadian jurisdictions can emulate. With that, I thank you for your time and your careful attention to the presentation. Now, Joe. If there's any questions, I'll attempt to answer them. Make sure you introduce yourselves.
Hi, thanks. Bill Wareham from David Suzuki Foundation. That was fascinating. Thanks, and thanks for all your work, to all your folks for going through all that. It just had a question about the objectives for the area. I mean, obviously there's a conservation objective. I don't know how specific those are, but is there a mechanism built into the governance arrangement around how you track, monitor, adjust the plan based on what's actually happening with the resources in the area?
For sure, it's going to be a relationship. There's we'll work collaboratively to develop management plans, and then just like any other protected area, those management plans will be shared with all those impacted around the Great Slave Lake in this case. That'll inform how that management plan works. And these are going to be 5 or 10-year management plans. And you try to reach those objectives of that plan during that time. But if there's changes required, I think we're flexible enough to make those changes on the fly. If we're, like I said, we're a small population, everybody kind of knows each other, and that type of relationship spurs changes if need be. Any other questions? All right, you have a good day. Thank you very much.